Robyn's experience in the entertainment industry, plus her training as a certified neuro-linguistic programming practitioner, gives her a really unique combination of fun, creative tools, and fascinating scientific research that helps her maximize personal impact and skyrocket success. For the past 20 years, she has successfully trained and coached thousands of business professionals from Fortune 500 companies and other noteworthy brands on how to really get out there and share their story in front of our audiences large and small. And when we talk about brands, I mean, she's worked with Morgan Stanley, she's worked with Lifetime Television, Jones New York, PayPal, Spotify, Hewlett Packard, lots of them. And so, Robyn, we're really excited to have you here to talk about this critical piece of the puzzle, which is your story. Your most powerful marketing tool is your brand story. Let's kind of jump in. And why is everybody talking about story lately? Why is it the new buzzword in the industry?
Yeah, exactly. Like, so many people are storytellers and talking about story, but the interesting thing about story is that it's the one thing that has lasted over time. You know, like our ancestors, the cavemen, were telling stories. And what they discovered in brain science, which is fascinating, and I'm sure other people have talked about this, is that when people are listening to a story, almost every part of their brain is engaged. You know, so the entire brain gets engaged when they're hearing story, which means that they have a different connection. They have a connection to you. They're listening more strongly, and they're going to remember more. So that's one of the most important parts about story, because it taps on the emotional part of learning. And it's like, so when we talk so much about the marketing and the sales, like, that's all of our left brains type of learning. And like, we know how to like take people's messages, and we know how to make lists, and we know how to do all that. That's all left brain stuff. But people make decisions based on their right brain, their emotional brain. And so when you can connect yourself to their emotions, that's when they want to make that decision with you.
Well, and it's memorable, right? Like, how many of you have listened to an expert in business and you really, truly don't remember what they talked about, but you remember the story? And that's what drives you to take action. I know I have done it. Like, I can't necessarily remember all the stuff, but I definitely remember the stories. And I do think it's a powerful part of our process right now. The other thing that's great about it is you can share your story for free. It used to be you had to get on, you know, radio ads or television in order to share your brand story. And now it's so accessible. What are some of your favorite ways that brands can position their story?
Yeah. When we talk about brand stories, like, there's a whole brand story thing. And it's like, and the point of the matter is, if you're an entrepreneur, you are your brand. And so I'd like to call it personal branding, but even in organizations, I go into organizations and I work with individuals within those organizations to discover their personal brand, because it's all your personal story. And like what you're talking about, how people remember me, I will have people that have seen me about, 5 years prior that will remember my signature story. And so when I'm talking about personal branding, I'm talking about how you can find out what your signature story is, which is usually attached to why you are doing something. And so there are 3 different types of stories that I feel is like really important for an entrepreneur or branding yourself. There's, first of all, there's a transformational type of story. And that's when you transform one something into nothing, like that butterfly into something. And that's my story. It's like what people remember about me the most is my literal nickname growing up was Shy. So people didn't even know my real name. They would I was introduced as Shy. So that's my transformational story, how that I transformed from this shy child into someone who can speak in front of 2,500 people without blinking, and then there's that another great story is a redemption story, like how you from a small David turns into this great Goliath. Like maybe you invented something, or you created something, or you had this tiny little system, and all of a sudden it blew up and it went viral, and now you're Goliath, and you have the keys to the kingdom. So that's one. And then another one is another great one is the magic bullet story. Whether you do, again, have a system that can switch off, like can change reality, change the way, like the Airbnb stories and all
Yeah.
of those kind of stories. But they all begin with you, who you are, why you are doing what you're doing. I mean, it's great. I'm sure that those Airbnb guys did not, I mean, you could just wake up and say, oh, I want to create Airbnb, but it's usually something within you that made you become the person that you are. And I am great at finding that out, because because that's what sets you apart from everybody else. So the thing is, like, so many people can do what I do and they have their why stories. So many people can do what you do, but you probably have a why. Like, why did it happen? Why this? Why do you do it that way? And when you can hone in on that, that creates your personal branding, and that no one can mimic, no one can imitate, no one has it. And that makes that connection between you and your listener.
Yeah, well, and what I want to point out with this is that people will funnel hack you, right? Like, if you get something that starts working really well, you will see copycats popping up that are taking parts of it, they're taking bits of it, they're trying to steal your traffic, and they cannot ever steal your story. And the reason why people choose you over someone else is not your information. I don't know anyone out there that has information that's so groundbreaking that we have to go to them because they're the only person that knows it. We info share. I mean, this is the information age of business. Information is a cheap commodity. It's everywhere. And your story is what connects them to you, which is why they ultimately buy from you, because they feel that you're the right person for them. So,
yeah, and so many people,
Go ahead. Finish your thought, because I have a good question for you.
Yeah. So many people will talk to you when they meet you, and they'll talk to you about what they do, and they forget to tell the story, because that is the hook. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that led perfectly into my question for you, which is, some people are really comfortable talking about what they do, but that story opens up a place of vulnerability. And in every good story, you do not look good through the whole story, right? In every good story, there's a part where you're not at the top. So how do you help people be honest and vulnerable and authentic and tell their story in a way that feels empowering to others and empowering to themselves?
Yeah. That's a great question. Like, the importance of that is the freedom that it gives you when you let it out. I mean, because people can smell vulnerability, people can smell authenticity. I mean, there is, like, the interesting thing with the neuroscience is, like, there are micro expressions that we have, there are micro things, so that when you're hiding something, people can sense it. So if there is something that is vulnerable in you that you decide that you're not going to share, people hear it anyway. They see it anyway. So you might as well get it out there in the open and have it working for you and not have it work against you, which is what happens when you keep it in. And so, like, digging in is, like, one of the questions I love to ask people about when they look to find their signature story is, what were you like, or what did you want to be when you were 8 years old?
Yeah.
Because sometimes in that area, in that period, is like the germ of who you were and who you are today. And I guarantee you that something that you are doing today can be traced back to who you were or what you wanted to be when you were around 8, 9, or 10. And that is the you that needs to come out, because that's the why. That's the seed behind what it is that you're doing. And when you can grab onto that, that is gold. People love it. And you feel so whole and free.
Yeah, I love that, because there's a feeling of imposter syndrome that I see so many people have, right? Like, they battle it, but really honesty is the absolute best way to be able to get yourself on top and overcome that feeling of imposter syndrome. It's that idea that if everybody knows what, that we are maybe not as great as we think that we are, or that we have moments of weakness or whatever, then we think that's going to somehow harm us or hurt us. But the reality is that we are like more relatable, we're more
Right.
accessible, we're more real, we're more somebody that they want to be involved with when we actually show that.
Exactly. When we have that vulnerability, then because I've heard so many times when I tell my story and they come off stage, it's like people then will say, I feel like I can do it now, which is why I tell my story. If I get up there and I'm like this polished professional and like, no,
Yeah.
I've always been this way, it's like, then it gives nobody hope. You have no hope. So what you're doing as a professional that is trying to guide something, I've been there, I know what it's like, and I know that you can get out of it too. You can walk down that road. You can change those brain connections so that you can become more powerful. And when we do that, that's when we're really giving to our audience and giving to our listeners, because it's giving them hope and it's giving them possibility. And we all have that imposter syndrome. It is so incredibly, and one of the things that I love to do with imposter syndrome is like you create your story, yeah, but you also can create your hero story, what I like to call your brand hero story or your avatar story. So something that you step into. When I was shy, the way that I got out of being shy was going into acting. So I had a character that I was stepping into the first time I stepped out of my shyness. So we can do that for ourselves, and that's the benefit that story will have. Because telling that story actually releases the audience, and strengthens you so much.
Yeah.
And it's also like, I don't know if we have time for that, but the thing is like, you have to be congruent with your story in the way that you tell it. So that's the other thing that I really like to work with.
That is good because, yeah, if congruency, I think, is really critical and important, because you seriously can't maintain incongruency if you're going to be a big brand. You can't remember who you were in front of any different audiences. So if you're not the exact same in front of all audiences, it is really challenging to remember, like, oh, who was I that day at that place at that time? And what if that same person circles back around? I love that congruency.
Yeah. You have to be congruent in your storytelling. You have to be congruent in the way that you're telling it. It's like, and you have to really relive it. If it's a sad story, you have to relive it. And I want to also get into the point where a lot of times we think that so many people have these stories that are so vulnerable, like they recovered cancer, I was broke, I was homeless, and all that. And so somebody might be out there thinking, I don't have any of that. That was me, but there are other things that you have. So don't be discouraged if you don't have one of those sob stories that, what Amy was talking about, being vulnerable. Sometimes being vulnerable is just admitting like what you were like then, or some of your other, and sometimes being very vulnerable is just telling this truth, just telling the truth.
Yeah. Well, let's call this out, because I was struggling with this recently, thinking like, do I really, I have a lot of good stories. I have a lot of analogies and things like that. But like that core moment of transformation for me is not as dramatic as it is for other people. But I shared at the beginning today my story of transformation, which involves me being a really mediocre entrepreneur. And let's just see if any of you were here this morning, how many of you could relate to that? Because I think it's a good point that it doesn't always have to be a big dramatic sob story like, my mother died at my 3rd birthday party and I was left homeless and I slept in my car until I launched my, I don't have that story, but I think a lot of people can relate to the frustration of just feeling like you're constantly mediocre. And everybody has that story. Everybody has that moment. And they don't have to relate to the details of your story. They have to relate to the emotion of your story. Yeah. And all emotions are human. It doesn't matter socioeconomic standard. It doesn't matter race. It doesn't matter religion. Nobody is free or exempt from human emotions. We all feel them.
Yeah. And interestingly, we feel them, and this is neither here nor there, but we feel them differently, which I just learned recently. It's like, everybody's anger is not the same. Everybody's love is not the same. So we feel our emotions based on when we first experience them. but we all feel them. So that's why, so sometimes some of those stories will touch somebody, what may not touch, but part of your story may touch somebody else.
Yeah.
So it's like, that, because like if you tell that story about being mediocre, but then you talk about that impetus that you want to grow. Oh yeah, I can relate to that. Because I've always been like this go-getter, right? And now I know what that's like, so it's like, so it's so interesting which parts of the story that people will relate to. Yeah. And I see Susan asked a question about like when somebody asks you what you do, how do you get into your story? And it's really, it's not that difficult because a lot of times when people say, what do you do? We always think it's like, oh, I have to give them a job title. No, you don't.
Or that elevator pitch that they'll forget in 5 seconds.
Yeah, it's like, you don't have to answer. They ask you the question. There's no rule that you have to answer it exactly as they asked it. So if somebody can ask the question, if you have a really strong story, if somebody asks you, what do you do? It's like, well, you know what? Between the ages of 1 and 8, I never spoke because that's how shy I was. I hated that feeling. It was a feeling of being unseen and invisible. I never want another human being to experience that. So what I do is I help people speak better. I help people get seen, get heard, and get ahead through helping them communicate and speak during presentations.
That was good. I think that would work. I love it.
Maybe.
Love it. Awesome. Yeah. Well, we so appreciate you being on today. I know you shared some great information. For everyone that's joining us and listening in, what's the best way for them to connect with you and get more information on what you do?
Yeah, my social media of choice is LinkedIn, so you can find me at Robyn Hatcher at LinkedIn. I also have a Facebook professional page which you can join, and my website is robynhatcher.com, where if you go to the resources section, I have a lot of actual great free resources of videos of body language, some giveaways, and I know that Stephen has a link to one of my ebooks, which is called Speaking You, which is a workbook of how you can create your own signature story.
Yes, well, we'll go ahead and pop that into the comments now. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your time and your effort.